There are people who believe that the US and USSR divided Korea intentionally and meant to keep it divided.
As the paradigm has shifted, as Kim Jong-un renounced the notion of reunification of the two Koreas.
올해는 1954년 제네바 회담 70주년입니다. 제네바 회담은 한국 전쟁이 끝난 이후 전쟁으로 해결할 수 없었던 한반도 분단 문제를 해결하기 위해 세계 각국이 모여 회의를 진행한 것입니다. 제네바 회담은 성공에 가까웠으나 결국 분단 문제를 해결하는 데는 실패했습니다. 그리고 그 이후 미국을 비롯한 해외 각국은 한국 통일을 위한 진지한 외교적 노력을 기울이지 않았습니다. 지난주 미국 평화연구소에서는 제네바 회담과 북한과의 관계 변화, 그리고 한반도 평화가 여전히 어려운 이유에 대해 전문가들이 모여 토론을 이어갔는데요. 외국 전문가들은 우리나라의 분단 문제를 어떻게 바라보는지 토론 영상을 살펴보겠습니다.
There are people who believe that the US and USSR divided Korea intentionally and meant to keep it divided. The documentary evidence shows that's not the case. That the division in 1945 was for the purpose of deciding who would receive the surrenders from Japanese forces. Soviets in the north and the U.S. Army in the south. But as early as 1947, there was a U.S.-USSR joint commission that was tasked with reunifying Korea. So in that joint commission, the United States proposed easing the border, so it could be cross-border traffic, common rail system, common road system, common postal service, and there'd be a joint Korean administration as the beginning of a government. Those are all U.S. proposals. The Soviets did not accept any of them and stonewalled. They would not negotiate. So because the Joint Commission was inactive, the United States then supported the establishment of the United Nations Commission on Korea, UNCOC, which operated between 1948 and 1950. The UN mission was to reunify Korea also. That was its goal. It operated in South Korea. It was headquartered there. North Koreans and the Soviets would never allow the UN Commission to even enter North Korea. So more stonewalling. Then we have the war.
Perhaps the most important part of what happened in 1953. So after 3 years of military conflict and bloodshed that cost well over millions of lives, the United States and North Korea used diplomacy to agree on an armistice or a truce that ended military hostilities. It was the longest negotiated armistice in history, 158 meetings that spread out over 2 years and 17 days. In a televised address, shortly after the armistice was signed, President Eisenhower had these words to say, quote, "So at long last, the carnage of war is to cease, and the negotiation of the conference table is to begin." Another significant aspect of the armistice agreement was that the military commanders on both sides recommended that a political conference be held to resolve what the war could not. And that political conference ultimately was held the next year in 1954 in Geneva, Switzerland. For a variety of reasons that Mark will get into, that conference did not succeed in resolving the Korean question. And then for the next 70 years, the United States and North Korea basically have not held any serious discussions to resolve the Korea question. What happened at that conference and why did it fail? That's one of the questions we're going to get to today.
What I want to talk about is the 1954 Geneva Peace Conference, which is largely forgotten. There are hundreds of books written about the Korean War. There's not one book on the peace conference. After the war, the armistice, which I will not talk about, that's for our other guest. But in the armistice, there's an Article 4, which calls for a high-level political conference to resolve the Korean question and withdrawal of foreign troops. Korean question meaning reunification. So the Military Armistice Commission that was established by the armistice had as one of its tasks to prepare for that high-level political conference. This time the Chinese and the North Koreans would not allow that to be on the agenda for those discussions. So it didn't happen. U.S. again frustrated because the U.S. government wanted to do something towards reunification. So there was a four-power conference in Berlin in early 1954. It was to discuss Germany, but also discuss Korea. The four powers were U.S., USSR, France, and UK. And so the four powers agreed to convene the political conference in Geneva that year to deal with the Korean question. Now, it's important this was not a United Nations conference, because after the war, the Chinese and North Koreans viewed the UN as a belligerent. So this had to be something apart from the United Nations. Four powers convened it. The U.S. did not recognize China. So the way it was done in practice was the Soviet Union invited China and North Korea to the conference in Geneva. The U.S. invited the United Nations sending states, those who were involved in the Korean conflict. 13 of those, so it was 13 plus 3, 16 parties were in Geneva. Close the conference came to succeeding. First was withdrawal of foreign forces from the peninsula. And a notional timetable was agreed. Basically, we had our elections already. Elections should only be in the north. But under pressure at the conference, the South Koreans agreed for nationwide elections. And by that, the North Koreans were concerned that because South Korea had a bigger population than North Korea, in any kind of a new government, they would be outnumbered and would therefore lose power. The fourth part was supervision of the agreement. On that, the United States insisted the United Nations would supervise the agreement. Chinese, North Koreans insist there be a neutral nations commission that would supervise the agreement. And it was on that point negotiations failed. And even beyond that, kind of ironically, the U.S. delegation had in its back pocket a deal to propose in case the conference failed. And that deal would have had practical steps towards unification. The Chinese, we know from the post-war archives, had the same proposal pretty much in their pockets. Chinese had their proposal in the back pocket, we had ours, and they never discussed them. And that's a Geneva story. And I think it's worth remembering because of the goodwill that was there to try to resolve the problem, and they almost did.
Great, thank you so much, and you have left some time to spare. Now we're going to turn it over to Lieutenant General Leaf.
I'm not going to detail the armistice. I'm going to describe it and describe why I think it's been rendered moot by events and why that mandates a different approach. My first exposure to the Korean environment came in 1978 as a forward air controller at Osan. And my primary job in controlling South Korean aircraft on training missions in the P518 Korean Tactical Zone, as it was called, was to keep them from going too far north. And that is sort of emblematic of the armistice, intended to forestall the renewal of direct conflict between the two sides. And it was intended to be temporary, as described, and we were intended to get beyond that with a lasting peace agreement, and that didn't happen. So there were efforts to move beyond the armistice agreed framework in the six-party talks in the symmetry of the Trump era, but nothing that made pursuing resolution of the Korean War and replacement of the armistice a specific policy priority for the United States. And as the paradigm has shifted, as Kim Jong-un renounced the notion of reunification of the two Koreas, I'd like to quote from a letter that the North Koreans sent to the U.S. Congress in 1974, and I quote, "At present, the armistice agreement has already become outdated and does not conform to the reality in many respects. To replace the armistice agreement with a peace agreement brooks no further delay." We can't do that by engaging North Korea right now because they won't. As Frank alluded to, they've shunned contact on almost any matter, and that's because of two hang-ups, if you will, the issue of denuclearization and the matter of North Korean human rights. I'm not advocating for a unilateral peace agreement. I don't think that's appropriate, but I am suggesting that we need to make that resolution a stated policy priority. One is to move to a paradigm where we can talk to North Korea and avoid conflict. Two is to lessen the nuclear threat. I think there is a legitimate risk of nuclear war that is greater on the Korean Peninsula than anywhere else. And as a military man for 33 years, here's what haunts me. Well, two things haunt me. One is the conditions under which North Korean citizens live. That haunts me. But what also haunts me is my imagined image of a Marine, a U.S. Marine, during the Chosin Reservoir battles, bleeding out in the snow with his comrade holding him, assuring him that his suffering would not be in vain and that things would be resolved. I think we owe it to those lost and those who suffered on both sides to resolve this issue and move on.